So I think that the mid to late 60s, the movements that were political, social, cultural, have been on, I think, people's minds to be reconsidered lately. And there's many reasons for that. And one of the other summer research residents, Ollie, their focus was on acid communism, which has been discovered as a manifesto-like document that was unfinished by Mark Fisher. And he proposes the idea that psychologically profound experiences, including the use of psychedelic drugs, should be used to galvanize anti-capitalist movements. He had taken a cue from his friend Jeremy Gilbert, who then coined acid Corbynism, which is represented here. And he's a scholar who has long maintained that the 60s might serve as a blueprint for contemporary leftist revolution. So then we're also currently seeing a resurgence of youth protest culture around gun control and Black Lives Matter in the United States, and then the more global climate crisis protests. And this also has a similar comparison to the 60s, not only because of that, but in the 60s is also fueled by a generational gap. So in the 60s, I couldn't actually find a figure for it, but obviously after the baby boom after the war, there were more young people than older people. And then that's becoming to be true again, at least not more, but kind of at least roughly equivalent. And then actually millennials are outnumbering baby boomers, and then Gen Zs are outnumbering millennials now. The mid-60s is also the rise of more body-based social and performative forms of arts, such as happenings, and an intense mixing of arts, culture, and politics. There's an emphasis that coming up on ludic strategies in art and philosophy, especially with Guy Debord and Lyotard, and the spread of game theory to more and more fields. So game theory was being developed kind of before the war and very intensely in the 50s. So while game theory is not perhaps as playful as other forms of ludic thinking, I think this is the beginning of a so-called ludic age that some claim that we are now entering, but I think it's started before that. So there are many neo-anarchist movements in the 60s, and there were many efforts to merge art and politics or use art and culture for social change. I want to hone in, though, on one group that was especially powerful in their use of playfulness, games, and ludic approaches. This is Provo. Not only were they playful, they were sometimes even mystical, but they also affected real societal change and were even able to elect some of their members into the Amsterdam City Council and make some of their political agendas reality. I will argue that it was precisely their emphasis on playfulness and sociality, that helped them to be effective in their drive for direct actions, and how that can perhaps serve as a model or inspiration for us today. And then as well as giving one example of things that are happening that I feel follow a bit in the spirit of the Provos. So the Provos were a group of young Dutch anarchists who sought to provoke people into action by utilizing imaginative forms of direct action, attacking conformity, obedience, and consumerism, and developing a new kind of radical politics transcending the class struggle politics of more traditional socialists and anarchists who looked to the working class as the agent of revolutionary change. The Provos, short for provocateurs, devoted themselves to bringing political and social issues to public attention by means of protests, demonstrations, and happenings. Their activities were nonviolent and contained large elements of playfulness. Well, nonviolent, I don't know, that's maybe debatable. But indeed, many Provos considered their purpose to bring it out of their fellow citizens, the repressed homo ludens, or human at play, or of play, a term originally coined by the noted Dutch historian Johan Huizinga. And I'm sorry if I'm going to botch so many Dutch names in this talk. Sorry if there's any Dutch people out there. It was active, Provo's was actually active for a relatively short time, officially only from 1965 to 67. But in that time, it attracted followers all over the West and had stopped a procession of a monarchy in Amsterdam, and again, like I said, elected some of its members to the City Council of Amsterdam. So what is the proletariat? In their own words, they are provos, beatniks, pleiners, nozems, teddy boys, rockers, blousons, noirs, hooligans, mangupi, students, artists, misfits, anarchists, ban the bombers, all those who don't want a career and who lead irregular lives, those who come from the asphalt jungles of London, Paris, Amsterdam, New York, Moscow, Tokyo, Berlin, Milan, Warsaw, and those who feel ill-adapted to this society. The proletariat is the last element of rebellion in our developed countries. The proletariat is the slave of the politicians, watching TV. It has joined the old enemy, the bourgeoisie, and now constitutes with the bourgeoisie a huge gray mass. The new class opposition in our countries is the proletariat against this mass. But the proletariat is not a class. Its makeup is too heterogeneous for that. Within the Provo, there were four main groups of people entered around different activities. So there were the happeners, so those who made happenings happen in Amsterdam and Antwerp and other places, combining nonviolence with absurd humor to provoke the police. The police were regarded as essential non-creative elements for a successful happening and co-happeners. There were the beatniks and hipsters, and there's no explanation what they do, but I guess they make it look cool. The thinkers, so those that were publishing Provo ideas in magazines and pamphlets, including Provo, Revo, Indelicht, and the University of Amsterdam Student Weekly Proprieteurs. There were many different publications that they made. And then there were the activists or the street provos who engaged in direct action with intent to influence public opinion. So with the provos, there's a marriage of play and provocation and direct action, and an emphasis on classlessness, and then also of magic. So the happenings end of Provos kind of didn't start with, but then merged with a circle that was starting to form around this guy, Robert Jasper Grootfeld. His absurdist anti-smoking, which were really anti-consumerist, anti-advertising protests and critique of Western society, he made a bunch of happenings and rituals around this. He was already well known in the 50s as a kind of performance artist. His father was an anarchist. He was a school dropout. He held some 60-odd jobs before becoming a full-time happener. It was when he was a seaman that he traveled to Africa. And supposedly there he was struck by the resemblance between tribal ritual and what he termed the addiction of the consumer in modern society, particularly symbolized by cigarette smokers. His inspiration, he self-mythologized, derived from this pilgrimage to Africa, where he had purchased a mysterious medicine kit formerly owned by a shaman, and this somehow mirrors and parallels Joseph Boy's mythic transformation, if you know him. The kit, he said, So smoking, according to Grootfeld, was an irrational cult, a pointless ritual forced upon society by the tobacco industry for the sole purposes of making profits. It should be noted that Grootfeld was a chain smoker. The bosses of the Nico Mafia, as he called them, were the high priests of this cult, and the ad agencies were powerful wizards casting magic spells over a hypnotized public. At the bottom of this heap laid the addicted consumers, giving their lives through cancer to the great Nico Lord. So Grootfeld is trying to intercept this by becoming an anti-smoking sorcerer himself. He began a one-man attack on the tobacco industry. First, he scrawled the letter K on cigarette advertisements, which got him arrested twice and sent to jail for 60 days, I think, each time. But it won him some publicity, and he was a true believer in the power of publicity. Then a rich restaurant owner wanted to support his efforts, and he gave Grootfeld a studio, which he dubbed the Anti-Smoking Temple. And he then obviously was the first anti-smoke sorcerer. He held weekly black masses with guest performances by other local underground artists. His sermons ended with the anti-smoking coughing song, which I have here. Do we have to watch the whole thing? Oh, well, it's too far into this. You can look it up on YouTube. Sorry, it's like halfway into this. So a note on happenings. So Michael Kirby wrote that happenings were hard to find, that they were rarely performed, and that the number of people who have seen them are small. So the general public must therefore depend on secondary sources of information about the happenings, which is somewhat like trying to understand what a painting is without having seen one. Thus, the personal emotional impact of the art form is lacking and only can be grasped intellectually. Happenings are carefully planned, programmed activities that seem to lack content because they are structure and only structure. The content is supplied by the audience, its participation in and its reaction to the happening, and its interpretation of what has been experienced. Kirby compares the happening to a three-ring circus, an art form without information structure and with simultaneous compartmentalization. Kirby calls happenings non-matrixed, which is to say that the performer is not integrated into the activities performing, but simply himself and expressing his emotions. So a performer sweeping the floor is himself and not Hamlet with a broom. And the role of the audience has changed as well. It is required to move around, to shout, and to perform as a chorus, performing according to highly structured instructions that have been handed out to them when they enter the theatrical space. The happening depends upon the audience to complete what it means, but of its own performance. Its reaction and its understanding of what has been happening, regardless of whatever planning that was done beforehand. This serves to destroy the traditional passive role of the audience, creating what amounts to a revolutionary new situation, or what definitely has the potential of such given the right circumstances. The happening is a catalyst. Whatever objects are employed in the happening are not necessarily changed, but the audience witnessing the event is allegedly changed. Because of the message of the happening states that reality is an arbitrary illusion. The happening jolts the spectator out of his illusion of reality. This curious juxtaposition of everyday objects and activities in ridiculous situations and incongruous locations serve to corrode the arbitrary sense of reality and also destroy the now intolerable boundary between art and life. Grootfeld burnt his anti-smoking temple down, and while the rituals actually keep continuing to happen there, he also began conducting his rituals in public. His rituals happened at the Spui. They started in public there in June 1964, and they continued every Saturday at midnight without interruptions, such as bad weather and police interference. So besides happenings, Grootfeld also employed ludic strategies, like the Mayor Huet game. So Mayor Huet is a shortening of the Dutch spelling of marijuana, and he defined Mayor Huet as anything that smokes, so straw, woods, weeds, and even marijuana itself, but never tobacco. The Mayor Huet game, after roulette, used the Mayor Huet substances listed above. So packages of Mayor Huet were made up with wood shavings, straw, or whatever, even marijuana, and then set into circulation, even putting them into cigarette machines. The goal was to sow chaos, particularly amongst the police, who had been conducting arrests for possession of marijuana. The rules for the Mayor Huet game appeared in a manifesto, Mayor Huet 2, authored by Grootfeld, which I think this is the picture from. He called it the manifesto a magic chain letter and requested that people copy it 5 times and circulate it amongst friends, giving his followers at the same time the freedom of improvising on the rules or adding to them. Everyone was to make packages of Mayor Huet. His names were often puns in Dutch, French, and English, and the merry puns were made at the expense of the Dutch brand names for cigarettes, as well as aspects of Dutch society. The puns often rhymed in Dutch and caught on easily in Amsterdam. Grootfeld stated that everything was Mayor Huet and that Mayor Huet was to be found everywhere. And then finally in this manifesto, the city of Amsterdam was identified as the magic center. The Mayor Huet game had a point system as well. A marijuana bust by the police or arrest was 100 points. A voluntary visit to the police station was 150 points, and so on and so on. No one understood the game. When tipped off, the police made regular raids on the Mayor Huet games, hoping to find marijuana and make an arrest, but they were never able to do so because the tips phoned in were made by the Mayor Huet players themselves, adhering to Grootveld's inane point system. Total chaos set in, and the police finally had to give up. In Grootveld's view, addicted potheads were being arrested by policemen who were nicotine addicts, arrests that were written up in the press or commented upon in the media by alcoholic journalists, and read or viewed by a public addicted in turn to cigarettes and television. So the great circle of life continues. In 1965, when Grootfeld had moved his rituals into the Spooi, a public square in Amsterdam, Roy van Doon started distributing his pamphlets there at midnight, at the midnight happenings/rituals. Van Doon was the political theoretician and founder of the Provo Movement. Van Doon was in his youth a pacifist and then an anarchist, but also inspired by Dadaism, German philosopher and counterculture guru to be Herbert Marcuse and the Marquis de Sade, but not the violent parts. Van Doon and a few others made a series of pamphlets called Provocaties and Provocations that they distributed in Amsterdam, and that would later evolve into the Provo magazine. Provo was actually first coined by Dutch sociologist Boykhuizen in a condescending description of the Noodzems. Born out of the post-war economic boom, the Noodzems were disaffected Dutch teens armed with consumer spending power. Part mods, part 50s, like you can also think of teddy boys or greasers in the UK or the US. Juvenile delinquents, they spent most of their time cruising the streets on mopeds, bored stiff and not knowing what to do. This will come up later. They were unemployable teenagers against an adult society in the modern welfare state, for they had not been given a role in which to participate socially or civically. So what became their favorite pastime? Raising trouble and shouting at old people and provoking the police. Roel van Doon, a philosophy student at the University of Amsterdam, was the first to recognize the Noodzems' slumbering potential. It is our task, he says, to turn their aggression into revolutionary consciousness. And while the anarchists could no longer hope for social revolution in the Netherlands, they could provoke the authorities, that is, to provoke the state. When Grootfeld read the first Provo Manifesto, he decided to cooperate. He says, when I read the word anarchism in that first pamphlet, I realized that this outdated 19th century ideology would become the hottest thing in the 60s. So Van Doon and the Provos understood the value of play and playfulness. Play, as well as having its own value into itself, had strategic applications for the proletariat. And again, in Van Doon's words, the playing proletariat must be very clever in his play, But it must be a play that has the appearance of a very intelligent struggle on the basis of a revolutionary conception, but nevertheless it is play. Because for authoritarian ethics which preaches forced labor and utility, play is not useful and voluntary laborlessness is the permanent provocation. The leaflets were followed by more elaborate pamphlets that announced the creation of the White Plans. So another artist, Constant Nieuwenhuis, I hope I got that right, who was involved also earlier with Cobra and the Situationist International, was instrumental in shaping the white philosophies and the White Plans. At the time, he was working on his New Babylon project. He wanted to find out what potential added value art can provide in intensifying daily life, one in which there's room for creative expression. He had abandoned painting at that point and worked solely on his New Babylon project from 1956 to 1974. With New Babylon, he envisioned a worldwide city for the future where land is owned collectively, work is fully automated, and the need to work replaced with a nomadic life of creative play. New Babylon is inhabited by Homo ludens, humans at play, who, freed from labor, will not have to make art, for they can be creative in the daily practice of life. Provo's renunciation of work appealed to the Nozems and marked an important ideological split with capitalism, communism, and socialism, all of which cherished work as a value in itself. Provo, however, sympathized more with Marx's anarchist son-in-law, Paul Larping, who wrote The Right to Laziness. So a list of the White Plans. There was the White Bicycle Plan. So this was actually the world's first bicycle sharing program. They proposed the closing of central Amsterdam to all motorized traffic, including motorbikes, with the intention of improving public transport frequency by more than 40% and to save 2 million guilders per year. Taxis were acceptable as long as they were electrically powered. And then the plan was initially rejected by city authorities, but then they just instituted it themselves. The police confiscated bikes, but then the Provos took them back again and put locks on them, and then painted the combinations to the locks on the bikes. There was the White Chimney Plan, which proposed that air polluters be taxed and the chimneys of serious polluters be painted white. There was the White Woman Plan, which proposed a network of clinics offering advice and contraceptives, mainly for the benefits of women and girls, with the intention of reduced unwanted pregnancies. I think there's an idea of polyamory being a good thing, but I don't know if that's in the White Women Plan. There's the White Chicken Plan. So kip was the Dutch slang for police, and that kip is chicken. And under this plan, police would be disarmed and placed under the jurisdiction of the municipal council rather than the mayor. There's the White Housing Plan, which I think it was promoting squatting, basically. The White Kids Plan, which proposed that there should be shared parenting in a group of 5 couples, and then the parents would take care of the children in groups. The White Victim Plan, which proposed that anyone having caused death while driving would have to build a warning memorial on the site of the traffic collision by carving the victim's outline 1 inch deep into the pavement and filling it with white mortar. And then the White Car Plan, which is the car sharing plan with electric cars, which was formulated after the White Bicycle Plan was rejected. So paradoxically, there's this emphasis on a laborless, freer society, more free time, but then a lot of actual political and social work going on to get these strategies together and enacted, and also getting people elected onto the city council to put these plans to work. And I believe they got 2 people onto the city council. So you could say it's a sort of mobilization of the free time of the youth of Amsterdam, who were also looking not only to escape from the rigid constraints put on them, the Netherlands being at the time highly puritanical, but also meaning and meaningful activity. So I would like to just bring up Sartre because I want to embody my inner high school boyfriend. And I think the theory of the 60s is kind of interesting to reconsider, and I think Sartre's concept of the fused group has helped, for me, focus what we could retain from the neo-anarchist movements like the Provos, and perhaps could be a necessary update to the change in their strategies. So Sartre coined the term the group infusion or fused group in his Critique of Dialectical Reason, first published in French in 1960 and then in English in 1976. The title calls up Kant and Hegel's influence on Marx. Some consider the book an interesting attempt to find room for creativity and spontaneity within Marxism, noting that Sartre rejects the dialectical nature of the dialectic, of nature and historical determinism, while preserving the social significance of human behavior. The fused group springs out of the alienated seriality, so the autonomized existence, characteristic of most human groupings, for which Sartre gives the example of people waiting in line in a bus queue in order to be transported to their various places of work. He calls this basic type of sociality collectives. Historically or temporally, one does not take precedence over the other, the relationship partaking rather of the nature of a reversible reaction. He does state, however, that groups constitute themselves as negations of collectives. However, in the Sartrean dialectic, the group can relapse into a collectivity, and such disintegration being predictable beforehand. Sartre seeks to explain the transition of oppressed classes from the state of being collectives to that of revolutionary group praxis. This transformation occurs when an oppressed group is pushed to a limit where life is no longer possible under conditions that the oppressors have imposed upon these whom they oppress. The oppressed group identifies a situation which they perceive a common danger to themselves and define themselves by a common objective that in turn identifies a common praxis. So that's the group infusion. His analysis of these groups resonates with Provo and other groups and events in the 60s. Sartre first described in his book the passive and anonymous forms of individual alienation. This is what he calls the practico-inert. And then he showed how a group introduces negation into history and shapes itself instead of being shaped. Events itself by breaking with this passive and anonymous society that an American sociologist called the lonely crowd. The fused group is dialectical, that is, it defines itself in opposition to something. In the case of the 60s revolutionary groups, this dominant culture of either religion and its repressions or consumerism and capitalism, and finds its power in negation. Psychoanalysis, Didier Anzieux, called these massive social upheavals and uprisings, such as Provo, and then the '68 May riots in France and the Black Panthers, etc., the historical upsurge of a wild flowering force of negation. It is the inroad of a Sartrean freedom, not that of the isolated individual, but the creative freedoms of groups. Because these groups form out of negation, the oppressive forces can be interpreted as the principal catalyst in forming revolutions. Co-happeners. But the contradiction of the fused groups for Sartre is that the very modality of the social group in which alienation is not to be found, the fused group, is so unstable, it's lacking in ontological essence, that it must introduce alienation in order to maintain itself. and alienation is then like the loss of individual freedom. Although this is always done unwittingly. Individuals join the group in order to become more numerous, but there has to be group discipline to some degree in order for the rebellious group to survive. What eventually emerges when a fused group does succeed in maintaining itself are those group modalities known as the organization and the institution that are the antithesis of the fused group and yet are the practical means of organizing and realizing the tangible aims of some of the original group's revolutionary ideas. So we have this contradiction here between the spontaneity and creative vital power of the fused group and then the alienating effects of an institution. Sartre had stated that the permanent fused group is an impossibility. When most neo-anarchist groups of the 1960s themselves voluntarily disbanded, Provo voted itself out of existence in 1967, but the people that got elected to city council served out their terms to 1970, I believe. Many neo-anarchist groups wanted to avoid the bureaucratic and uncreative natures of communist regimes. Sartre himself was not a fan of anarchism. He said, "It is obvious that anarchism leads to nowhere today as yesterday." But he did think that they contributed to the growth of useful things, such as French syndicalism, which is the union movement, which Nick talked about, is touching on. So is there a productive way out of this contradiction? Is there some way to mediate this tension between individual freedom and the alienating effect of groups turned institutions? One might think, and I think this is very potentially true, decentralized models of organization, perhaps decentralized autonomous organizations might be one way out. Also, the idea of spontaneously forming groups that work on specific issues, then disband when they are no longer necessary could also work. And maybe Extinction Rebellion is an example of this, we'll see. Decentralized organizations, however, need certain types of sociality, ones that are not taught to people widely and aren't actually very intuitive. And that is the ability to facilitate decentralized groups and the ability to recognize and responsibly exercise one's agency. So I wanted to provide an example I've encountered of a network or community that is using something quite playful, creative, and ludic in nature at the core of their activities and is connecting to social change in very different ways in the Provo, but I find some resonance. So LARP, that's an orc. Progressive or Nordic LARP, for those of you that don't know it, so LARP is live action role play, and in the Nordic countries, they've developed a form of LARPing that's not always fantasy-based, and it could be any kind of social system that they simulate. And there's actually kind of a de-gamified version of LARPing that more focuses on character development, co-creation, world building, and safety, emotional safety of all the participants and the organizers. In this slide in particular, this image is of an orc from a LARP developed by the Rollspelfabriken and Larpers of the World, which I'll talk about later, at a festival of politicians in Denmark. It happens once a year in the summer, and the LARP had these participants that had to go find out different politicians and talk to them, take selfies with them, but they did it as orcs trying to advance an orc agenda, which was actually the agenda of the Larpers. And actually it was agenda of the youth and the problems that young people have when they try to gather and perform civic, have activities in civic spaces. So you could say each LARP itself, so each LARP that's played is a fused group, people coming together with the common purpose of play in some way. Spontaneous and improvised experiencing of some fictional setting, of a simulation, of characters. Although there's not always a political aim, in general, progressive LARPers have self-transformation, understanding the world and its complex systems, and changing society as a general goal of their activities. Most LARPs and para-LARP activities, so para-LARP is what happens before or after the runtime of the LARP, use organizational tools from many sources, including anarchist organizational techniques, things like theater of the oppressed, improv theater, authentic relating, things like that. Each LARP is a temporary fused group brought together not through negation, but rather through the goal to play together, to have an interesting experience, a sort of meta conceit or decision to purposely and creatively be social together. Nordic LARP is a federation of certain people from many more regional scenes that still exist and don't consider themselves Nordic LARP. And they all can be quite different from each other. And I think this act of federation, while controversial, is important, controversial within the LARP world. Somehow in the ideology of the communities, there's an idea that there is value in finding some common ground, but still letting local cultures flourish as they will. Because the Nordic LARPers so cherish this form, this LARPing, and because they are in Scandinavia, there are funds to organize and to make LARP NGOs. They receive not only cultural funding, but also youth development funds. As there's a massive movement to LARP with kids as either educational activities or free time activities. So then there becomes this institutional umbrella or a series of umbrellas over this community. The emphasis on working with youth, but also with adults, is the development of, or what they would like to develop is awareness, both of the self and of group dynamics, understanding certain histories and societal problems like the asylum-seeking process, prisons, war, gender issues, etc., and to see these issues as embedded in complex systems. Because of the typical structure of a LARP consisting of workshopping beforehand and then debriefing after, participants not only simulate from an embodied first-person position a complex system, they can analyze it together afterwards. Not all, but many LARPers also organize and design LARPs, all of which, especially over repeated and sustained engagement, then also helps to generate understanding, but also develop skills, such as the building of social groups, bonds, and connections and support, devising and prototyping new ways to be social in low-pressure, low-risk situations, the ability to facilitate decentralized groups, decentralized ways of organizing themselves, ownership and responsible use of agency through the use of personal safety mechanisms and protocols, designing, prototyping, and analyzing systems, and understanding complex systems. So this will become more and more, I think, a necessary skill for the general population to solve complex problems we face as a globalized society. So this is a picture from the Rollspilfabriken in Denmark, and they offer sustained LARPing all year round with youth and adults. And they believe that they can build community, and it's often through the LARPing, and it's often a source of an extra support system to the youth that are involved, which often stay involved for many years. Because it's LARP, and LARP explicitly is about building systems, rules, and protocol, this is a community that explicitly addresses social protocol and organization meta and on meta level on themselves. So, for example, my friend Anders, who works for this organization, was telling me about a discussion they had in the community about how to support members through a breakup. So there was a heated debate that led to a protocol. If you were the first person to hear about it, you would send a code red to the others, and then the members of the community would gather around this person if it was needed or wanted. The contents of the LARPs themselves are also politicized. For example, they play out these fantasy situations, not as like good versus evil, but that each of the characters, so an orc is traditionally the evil one, they're all just serving their own interests. And so the idea is that children get introduced to the complexity of politics, basically, and they develop a more complex view of the world. And this is non-dialectical, and it's complicated, and it gets out of a good versus evil, us versus them mentality. Also, through the organization, members learn how to organize, how to write funding applications, how to read political papers and propose changes. So then the political activity is mimicked in the LARPs themselves, and then also in the structure of the organization and organizational activities. There is a certain addressing of this alienation versus membership contradiction. In Nordic LARP, there's a constant discussion and development of mechanisms and structures that can balance the rights of the individual. So in a LARP, that's to have a good time and not be harassed and things like that, with the good of the LARP. And these are constructed in play mechanics, but also in the mechanics of the community and the organizations themselves. And then there's also this effort. So I think this federalization of the Nordic scene, they're branching out to other communities outside of the Nordic countries. This is one initiative that called Larpers of the World. And it's actually 9 NGOs right now from Denmark, Norway, Belarus, Finland, Russia, Poland, Germany, Palestine, and Sweden. So using the cultural cachet and state support of the Scandinavian EU countries to help support financially, institutionally, perhaps infrastructurally, people within all of these countries, but especially lending it to the other countries like Belarus and Palestine that don't have as much access to that. And the goal is to create democratic civil society organizations to facilitate LARPs, but also to facilitate civic groups themselves. And it also trains people to be able to facilitate groups and make decisions and exercise agency responsibly. I think that and here's some cute people from that group. I think that there's something also to be said about the privacy of LARP, and which is at the core of the community's activities. It can start to twist my mind up a bit, because I think that what was so amazing about the Provo is that they did take direct public action and also wanted to enter the government, at least on a city level, to at least provoke and make waves. But trying to make the opposition look bad in this day and age is maybe not the best strategy anymore, especially as they capture that and use it for strengthening their stances, see Trump, and the militarization of the police force and the surveillance state. But I think the insights and bonds and such gained by LARPs are that of a political nature, or looking at societies and systems that then can be implemented. They can then implement these insights outside of their magic circle. So many LARPers are in the tech industry, they're in the gaming industries, they're academics, they're politicians, or they're in groups that interface with the government. So it's maybe a strategy closer to the invisible strategy of the family in America. A conservative group that seeks to strengthen bonds and give support system to each other, but in that case, it's more rich white males, and also giving value and causes for the members to believe in. While not being overtly engaged with as much governmental or state change as the Provos tried to, there is, at least on the micro level, goal of LARPers of changing people, of making better humans. humans more able to play, to be spontaneous and vital, and to be social in responsible ways. There's also, I think, the politicized space of free time. So in this day and age, one is either a full-time wage laborer who then must find meaningful activity for one's 8 hours of non-work a day, which actually in the, say, United States, lots of people work 2 jobs. So it might not be much if you have to rest and take care of children, etc. But how much meaning can one find in a late capitalist society, especially if one is not religious? Or you're either a laborer that's more of like the freelancer ilk, so everything is play and everything is work, and it's all mixed up in this 16-hour regimen a day. Perhaps the explicit carving out of a private, non-productive, co-creational, playful space is a political statement in itself. And as work has shaped meaning in the West for so long, on both the left and the right, politically, religiously, and socially, what happens to the meanings of our lives once work is redefined or taken over by automation? I think this struggle for meaning is the space that LARP and art and cultural and social practices that are similar to it can help address. Thanks, that's the end.